Andrew Matthews has written a great little book called Being Happy. He writes, have you ever noticed in life that things can look really bleak just before a dramatic turn for the better? He says, don't be fooled. The 11th hour is usually an impostor. At the time of the Second World War, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister at what has been described as Britain's darkest hour. He said, I felt as if I was walking with destiny and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. I thought I knew a good deal about it all. I was sure I should not fail. Churchill came to power at the 11th hour and against great odds led the free world back to sanity from an abyss. Britain's 11th hour was not the 12th. Eventually, due to the sacrifices of many, the Allies prevailed. We remember that today with deep gratitude as we remember the Knox veterans who returned to rebuild society after the war on behalf of those who made the supreme sacrifice. There was once a great famine in Samaria, and the king of Syria chose to lay a siege outside the walls of the city. His strategy was to starve them out. Inside the city, things grew desperate. Food became impossibly expensive, with 5 pieces of silver needed to buy just 1 measure of corn. They were slaughtering donkeys and horses for food. In fact, it got so bad that children were killed and eaten. Like Palestine today, the situation was entirely desperate. What was once valuable became worthless, like the woman on the Titanic who rushed back to her stateroom not for her priceless jewels, but for a couple of oranges for the lifeboats. At this terrible moment of darkness, Elisha the prophet made an absolutely ridiculous prophecy. He said, tomorrow a measure of flour shall be sold for a shekel. In other words, the corn is going to be sold at the old rate at the city gate. And one of the king's trusted advisors uses one of the few pieces of recorded sarcasm in the Bible, saying, behold, if the Lord could make windows in heaven, might this thing be, in our terms, do pigs fly? At this 11th hour of desperation, in this case at twilight, some lepers developed Churchillian kinds of courage. They got together. Their reasoning was flawless. They said, why are we sitting here in the ghetto? We're only going to die anyway, so why not give the Syrian camp a try? All they can do is kill us, and they might just save us alive. So with all that was left of their courage, they trotted off, a strange little band. Meanwhile, the Syrians had abandoned camp. They'd heard a noise of chariots, a noise of horses, a noise of a great army, and they figured, the jig is up. They reasoned that Israel's allies had come upon them, so they ran for their lives, leaving everything behind, including lots of food. What a scene the lepers were to behold. Stuff strewn everywhere, stacks of provisions and food. They stuffed themselves, they looted, and then their consciences struck them, and they said, we do not do well. This is a day of good tidings. If we tarry until the morning light, some mischief will come upon us. So they went back to the city to tell the king that the siege had been abandoned. Of course, they were not believed. Must be a trick of some kind. How can there be light after so much darkness? But they eventually go outside the city and find things exactly as the lepers had said. And in the same day, in the city gate, a measure of fine flour was sold for a shekel. What happened? It was the 11th hour principle that they had not considered. It had kicked in. There's another illustration of the 11th hour principle in the Psalms. They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, they see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. What was the problem for the sailors? Well, a storm blew up. It got darker first, then the winds came, then the waves got taller and taller. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distresses. To their amazement, the sea got calmer, and they made harbor. Darkest before the dawn, the 11th hour principle. St. Paul took a voyage on the Mediterranean, and that sea can be treacherous. Today, it's the most dangerous sea for migrants in the world. When St. Paul set out, after prayer to God, he had special knowledge given to him. They were going to be shipwrecked, but everybody would be saved. So he predicted this to the centurion and the ship's master. Did they believe him? No. He was a prisoner, for goodness sake, a religious fanatic on his way to Rome. But then the storm comes up, and it gets very dark, and Scripture says, then fearing lest we should have fallen on rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. Have you ever done that? Hung on in the darkest moments of your life with 4 anchors to the stern? When dawn came, St. Paul urged everyone to eat. They were going to have to swim for their very lives. Suddenly, out of the mists of the night, land appears. There's a creek that runs into the sea with a beach. They hoist the mainsail, gets stuck at a place where the 2 seas meet. The stern of the ship is pounded in cross waves and starts to break up, miraculously providing pieces of wood for the non-swimmers to hang on to. On some on boards, some on broken pieces of the ship, the swimmers make the beach, and when all are counted, the whole 276 are safe. Darkest before dawn, the 11th hour principle. Andrew Matthews says, once we recognize the 11th hour for what it is, life loses a lot of its trauma. The universe seems to test us to see if we're serious about attaining our goal. Then if we are, and hang on just a little bit longer, bingo. It says that once we figure out the 11th hour principle, we can actually look into the future and tell ourselves, so everything is going wrong. This could mean that everything I've been striving for is just around the corner. And this is not Pollyanna. Let me inject here a note of biblical caution, however. The 11th hour is not the 12th. Once I was with a family in Stratford who had just been told that their child was going to die. That the disease the child had was incurable and was going to get worse. They experienced the 12th hour. There was no hope for a cure. Hard. So hard. The 12th hour is the experience of Jesus on Good Friday. And when the darkness comes, it's at noon, the 12th hour, and the darkness covers the land. I'm sure that those parents felt as Jesus did when he asked the question, God, why have you forsaken me? There's no immediate answer. But according to the biblical record, 3 days later, we glimpse briefly into what happens when all of us die. We get an insight into the next life in the resurrection of Jesus. It's only a short window, but it's enough to found a church, without which this church would not be here today. The post-Easter Jesus can still be experienced 3 ways: guidance and comfort and our prayers. That's the faith. The resurrection is recorded. It means that life goes on past the 12th hour. That was the hope for those devastated parents and for that little boy himself. You see, a lot of things are not as they appear. 2,000 years ago, Caesar Augustus, in the dark days of his power, when Jesus was born, didn't much care for the country of Palestine. Birth of a child in Palestine would have been a yawn for him. But in this very dark time of world history, the light of the world was born. Who would have been considered significant then? Mighty Caesar or this child born of a peasant woman? You see, things are not often what they seem to be. A child whom Augustus would never have even heard of has been on the lips of billions for the past 2,000 years, giving people hope in their darkest moments. Caesar's plan was to tax the parents of Jesus along with everyone else. He was the kind of guy who found Rome built in brick and left it in marble. But God's response to Caesar's taxation was to take Jesus' parents to Bethlehem, there to fulfill a prophecy made about 730 years before Caesar Augustus. But thou, Bethlehem, Ephratah, though thou be little amongst the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth, whose goings have been from old, from everlasting. He shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be a man of peace. The darkness before dawn, the taxation that forced this man Joseph and this woman Mary to return to their ancestral home, the difficulty of travel with a pregnancy on the road, a birth in a manger actually gave to the world the light of the ages. There has been no one like him before or since. So I want to ask you today, have you cottoned on to the 11th hour principle in your own life? When you ask yourself, why am I here, or why is this happening to me, ask yourself a third question. Is there a lesson here for me? It's my experience that when we've learned a lesson, we will often be tested. And when the lesson is learned, the test will be easily passed. We need to remember that lessons keep repeating themselves until we learn them, and that's life. Seems to me that this 11th hour principle then could be all about testing. Are we serious about attaining our goal? Serious achievement always seems to require persistence and grit. At the 11th hour, will you persist? Will I? You see, in the 11th hour, it's far easier to quit than to carry on. As Barack Obama once said, it's far harder to prevent a war than to start one. Appeasement was the lesson that led to the darkest hour. Did we learn that lesson? Sometimes for self-preservation, to quit is the smartest move, particularly when the ship is sinking. But that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about a quitting pattern that you might be following every time the 11th hour rolls up for you. You see, faith is not tested when the sun is shining and everything's going fine. It's when it's dark and the darkness and negativity are unrelenting. That's when faith shines. How do we get through these tough times? By believing the truth of this mighty verse. All things work together for good to those who love God. I've come to believe that this is the principle that upholds the entire universe. It's also what lies behind the 11th hour principle. It can also take us through the 12th hour, our own death, and the death of those people that we love. There was a famous opera singer in New York. Her middle child, a very beautiful little girl, blonde, blue-eyed, stared out at the world with inscrutable eyes. She was completely unresponsive. After 8 years of silence, with the experts saying that nothing could be done, the child lived in what appeared to be a chemical or physical prison. She was uncontrollable on her wild days. The mother asked a woman called Frances, who was an expert at working with retarded children, whether she would try with Dorothy to get through to her and teach her something, anything. that would make her life better. Frances agreed to take the child on for a month. She spent hours with Dorothy, day after day. When the silence grew unbearable, she would sing old hymns to her from her own childhood. The child seemed to respond to the rhythm, walked around in time to the music. At school, Dorothy simply stared straight ahead, and the teacher told Frances, "She's unreachable." The full-time nurse in Dorothy's home said the same. The nurse thought it was a shame that this child was allowed to sit at the table with the others. She should be kept away. The only thing that Dorothy ever did was to draw wavy lines. Nobody knew why. Would Frances ever be able to reach this child? It's darkest before the dawn. Was it time to give up or persist? Was it the 11th hour or was it the 12th? One day, Frances sat down at the opera singer's grand piano. In that gracious New York living room, Dorothy came and sat down beside her. Frances started out with the Fenwick Holmes songs called Songs of Silence, and she started to sing and play when halfway through one song, another, pure child's voice suddenly joined hers. Dorothy was singing, word for word, with perfect pitch. She was singing far better than the average 8-year-old. Frances heard someone sobbing. She turned to see Dorothy's mother in the doorway, tears streaming down her cheeks, unable to do anything other than hold out her arms to her child. After that, things began to change for Dorothy. From song to speech, her bottled-up tensions disappeared, and her wildness left her. The full-time nurse, however, couldn't adjust to the change, and so she quit. You know, good news sometimes really scares people. See, Frances had come originally with this 8-year-old for a month. Left when she was 13. Dorothy was utterly transformed. She, at 13 years, was poised, self-sufficient, capable. Frances, when Dorothy had enough words, asked her, "What are those wavy lines about?" "Oh, that's what the wind looks like," said Dorothy. Frances hung in there long after the experts had quit, because she believed that if there is life, there is hope. And that's always true in the 11th hour. So I am going to ask you, are you discouraged today? Are you at your wit's end? Have you lost a loved one, or your job, or your best friend? Are you distressed because someone has hurt you, or your finances are on the rocks? Are you reeling around like a drunk on deck? Do you believe that your depression's never going to lift, and that you're always going to be discouraged like this? Have you thought that the 11th hour is the 12th, and have you given up? In 2024, try and figure out where you are on the clock. You see, the 12th hour is for finality and for death. The answer to the 12th hour was given 2,000 years ago, and it founded this church. And it's this: the resurrection means that even in the face of the finality of death, there's hope. Life goes on beyond the grave. We will see our loved ones, our war veterans again, those names that I read that now nobody knows who they are. We're going to meet those who made the supreme sacrifice for us and for our children. Why? Because the world and our own complexity is too vast to have no purpose beyond this life. Nothing is ever lost. All things work together for good. If you and your relatives are experiencing the 12th hour, I want you to cling to this verse. All things work together for good to those who love God. But if you're in the 11th hour, the hour of testing, remember these words. They cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distresses. He made the storm a calm, so that the waves thereof were still. And they were glad when they were quiet, so he brought them into the desired haven. When Jesus was on the lake with his disciples, they shook him awake at the 11th hour, believing they were all going to drown. And he stood up in the boat and said, "Peace, be still." And there was this great calm. And he can do the same for you today. You know, his name, Emmanuel, means God with us. He left us one mighty promise. The last words he said here on the earth were these: "Behold, I am with you to the end of the world." What could be better than that? For as the great companion is the master of both hours, the darkness has no choice but to yield to the dawn. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.